Okay. Okay, thank you very much, Robert, for the nice introduction. And today I'm going to talk about accurate contactless moisture measurement based on modern ultra-compact near-infrared spectrometer technology. My name is Robert Zimmerleiter. I'm a research scientist at RECENDT, and here I'm mainly working with compact near-infrared spectrometer technology, and also I'm concerned with Raman measurements, mainly for industrial applications. But with no further ado, let's jump into the topic in hand. So first of all, I want to give you a little bit of an idea why inline moisture measurements are important. And yeah, the moisture of products and raw materials is of great importance for many industrial branches. So this is not limited to single industrial branches, but you have water in almost everything. You have the food industry, the wood industry, paper industry, polymer industry, chemical and pharmaceutical industry, just to name a few. And some of the key benefits of especially inline moisture measurements are a huge potential to save energy just by optimizing drying processes that are very common in the industry, and also avoid over drying, which is sometimes necessary just to ensure that the product is dry enough. Another big thing is it gives you the possibility to avoid mold-induced spoilage due to increased moisture in your products. This is especially a topic in the food industry, as you might know. There's also a strong economic factor involved, since most products and materials are traded according to weight, and people usually don't want to buy water, and they also don't want to have their products too dry in order to sell them too cheap. And also in some industries, there are very strict limits for the water content of products, just to ensure the highest possible product quality and purity. And what is especially a benefit of inline moisture measurements, where you don't have to take samples out of the process, is that you can have no errors during the sample collection, because your samples actually stay in the process and you can actually use them later, instead of taking samples out and bringing them to the lab and analyzing it. There's also usually this sampling error, because you don't know how homogeneous your samples are, and you just take out a very small portion, which you can later analyze. But despite all of these importances of the moisture measurements in the industry, product moisture is often not very well monitored in many industries. So how is it done currently? What's the state of the art? Mostly what most industries or companies do is that they determine the moisture using offline gravimetric measurements, using so-called moisture balances. Two of these are shown in the images on the right. There's many different manufacturers who produce these. Basically, you put in your sample, you weigh it, you dry it using halogen lamps or other heating systems, and then you measure it, the weight after it is dried, and then the difference gives you how much water was in your sample. But yeah, the big downside is you have no possibility for real-time measurement. You always have to take sample out, put it in the balance, click the button, and then wait for your result. So there's no direct process control possible, because there's also a significant time between taking the sample and having the result. There's also inline capable alternatives on the market, which are often based on the measurement of dielectric properties. Here are just some example in images, so you can get an idea what these sensors look like. They usually have to be either in contact or in close vicinity to the sample, which is fine for some products, but it can cause problems and is often not possible or desirable for some production facilities. So to the main topic of this talk, which is the near-infrared based moisture measurement. You can also use near-infrared spectroscopy to measure the moisture of your sample. How do we do this? So basically the strong absorption of water in the near-infrared region, which is, as you can see in the picture on the right, located right next to the visible light we see every day. You have the near-infrared region up until 2,500 nanometers wavelength approximately, and then you have the mid-infrared region, which is something else and has other problems, so we focus on the near-infrared region for now. And you have the water absorption in this region in the graph on the bottom right. You can see the three fundamental vibrations of the H2O molecule, also animated in these three little GIFs. You can see how the two hydrogen atoms move compared to the oxygen atom, and you have these three fundamental modes. And the combination of these modes, two combinations of these modes, you can actually see in the near-infrared region. one at around 1450 nanometers and one about at 1920 nanometers, which are these big peaks that you can see in the absorption spectrum. So this is where, when we shine light at these wavelengths on the water, it will pretty much absorb a big portion of it. And this is what we can use to measure how much water is there. So now, how do we do this? What is the basic setup of such a near-infrared based moisture measurement? You have a light source usually, which is mostly halogen lights. So a broadband light source that is also rather cheap. We use it to illuminate the sample. You collect the reflected light from the sample and spectrally resolve it with a spectrometer. And then the collected spectrum is then analyzed to get the moisture value out of it. For this, you can use machine learning algorithms, which basically take the information, take the spectrum, and then calculate you a value of moisture, so a percentage of water in your sample, give it to your process control system, and then you have exactly a precise reading of the moisture in the sample just in your field of view. And on the top right, there's also a schematic drawing of how such a setup usually looks like. You have maybe some conveyor belt where your sample is moving. You have a measurement head where the light comes out, it shines onto the sample. Backscattered light goes in the head, and via an optical fiber, it goes to your spectrometer, which is mostly FTIR spectrometers are very often used in the infrared. And you get a sample like this that I took from the literature. You have a low water content spectrum of a certain sample in red, and you have a high water content sample in blue, and you can clearly see the difference, especially at these two water absorption bands. So what is the advantages? Of course, large measurement distances are possible. It really depends on how well your signal is, how strong your light sources are and stuff like that. But you can easily measure up to meters of distance. The closer you are, the easier it gets, but there's no real limitation of how far you can go, depending on your signal strength, of course. It is real-time capable, so a measurement also, of course, depending on the sample, but usually the measurement is in the second range. With the right instrumentation, you can get much lower. You can also measure in maybe tens or hundreds of milliseconds. You have automated measurements, so your measurement system does all the work for you. You basically turn it on, you have it measure, and then you get the reading out of it. And what is very nice about spectrally resolved measurements is that you can also extract additional information from your spectra about your sample. Since not only water absorbs in the near infrared, but other molecular bonds do as well, you can also have machine learning models for the protein content, for example, fat content or ash content of your samples, just to name a few that are usually interesting, especially in the food industry. Of course, other parameters of your samples can be modeled as well, but this has to be tested usually. So what is the downside? Why is not everyone doing this? A major downside that has been here for many decades now is the relatively high costs of conventional near-infrared spectrometers. So you have basically a lot of companies who offer very precise instrumentation for near-infrared spectroscopy. These are usually such 19-inch rack process spectrometers, and they cost most of the time up to 40,000 or over 40,000 euros. And for a simple moisture measurement, this is often not interesting for many companies to have such a high investment for a moisture sensor. So there's new developments on the market, which is the so-called MEMS-based infrared spectrometers. MEMS stands for micro electromechanical systems, and it's basically much smaller and low cost and rugged devices. Here on this image, you can see a nice size comparison. So this is like what one of these MEMS-based spectrometers looks like. It's like a cube, about 2.5 centimeters in each dimension. And compared to the big process spectrometer, of course, you can clearly see that it's much more compact. You can see it compared to a 2 euro coin up here in the photograph. And also importantly, it's much cheaper. Of course, it doesn't offer all the high performance of a 40,000 euro instrument, but for the moisture measurement, it usually is enough. So you have a significant price reduction for your near-infrared sensor, which is nice. You have higher ruggedness since you have no moving parts, which are often built into these process spectrometers. So you need to find a nice place for the spectrometer to rest still far away from your process and your conveyor belt and all the vibrations. This is not so much a problem with these small devices. You have strongly reduced space requirements. You have much lower power consumption. And overall, you have reduced maintenance efforts. So in the last years, many of these MEMS-based spectrometers have reached the market. Actually, there's many different manufacturers that offer these devices. There's many different wavelength regions available that they are sensitive to. And there's also a lot of different technologies that are based on a lot of different measurement principles. So basically, it is very important to know which instrument you want to have for your specific application. So it's not as easy as just going into the market, into the online shop and buy a sensor that is perfectly suited to your process. So you actually need to have a lot of background knowledge in order to know which instrument to choose for. But if you do a good job, you can easily replace the bigger and more expensive instruments. What is another nice thing about near-infrared-based moisture measurement is that you are very flexible concerning optical interface. This is especially true for these compact MEMS-based spectrometers. So what you can do and what you cannot do normally with the big devices is you take a spectrometer and put it directly at the measurement position. So you don't need to have any optical fiber networks installed in the production plant, which is also a bit of a hassle, and you need a lot of fibers and you need workers to install everything. And so you can just take your spectrometer and put it over the measurement position, have some halogen light sources, illuminate the sample and have the device measure directly there, and then just have a data connection to your process control system and get the value in this way without needing extra space for your instrument. And what you also can do, what has been done for decades now, is measure in liquids or liquid samples using commercially available immersion probes or flow cells. These are also available from many companies that have specialized in producing these kind of optical interfaces for liquid samples. And they're usually suitable for all kinds of harsh environments that are usually encountered in industrial production sites. And what you can also do, if the application allows for, you can use some of these compact spectrometers that have already built-in light sources, like the one you can see in the image, and put them directly to your sample and use the integrated light sources to illuminate your sample and measure the back reflected light directly without the need of any external light sources. So this is the most simple way, but here you have to be in a close contact with the sample. But if that's possible, this is also a nice option that you have. So in the measurements that I am going to show you, we used a spectrometer like this, which measures exactly the part of the near-infrared spectrum that contains the strongest absorption of water. So around of these wavelengths, so we measure the whole absorption peak around 1920 nanometers with a similar setup like this, mostly is used. But I will have some pictures of the setups later on. So we will have similar setups, but not always like this. And we measure, as I said, the strongest water absorption band in the near infrared region. Here's some example spectra from a sample that was dried during the measurement. And we can see that the moisture is in the blue spectra, the moisture is the highest, and the red ones is the lowest. And with drying, the signal around the water absorption band around 1920 nanometers significantly goes down. So since this absorption of the water is very strong in this region, this allows us to have very precise moisture measurements without needing to be in contact with the sample. So the first application examples I want to show you are from a project that is called EDDY, which stands for Enhanced Drying, and is part of the New Energy for Industry program founded by the FFG. And the optimization of industrial drying processes is the goal in this project, especially in the food industry, using numerical models and monitoring data. And this, the goal is to have an actual digital twin of the drying process and use it to optimize it and save energy and save on CO2 emissions in the process. And the role of RECENDT in this project is to actually generate reliable inline data of product moisture, which we will do by developing the so-called eddy sensors, which will then provide the amount of moisture that is present in the sample. And we have two use cases here. which will be the near-infrared-based moisture sensors for starch-derived products together with the company partner Agrana, and also for dumpling bread together with the company partner Fischerbrot. And they have very different drying setups. One has one of these spray dryers that you can see here on the top, and the other one has a conveyor belt dryer as schematically drawn at the bottom. So the measurement conditions are very different for both cases. But let me show you some measurements that we already carried out in the laboratory. So you have a rough idea how such a measurement looks like, at least in the laboratory environment. So the first one is the near-infrared-based moisture sensor for the starch-derived products, which is basically white powder, as you can see in the picture on the right. So in the laboratory, we did some tests how to get the best moisture readings, so the moisture values inline, so in real time, basically for these samples. And the best way to do it is to put your sample on a high precision balance, put it in there, and actually not have it dried, but moisturize it, because it sucks out basically the water from the air. So what we did is we used a basic humidifier, which humidifies the air around it and measure the weight gain in our sample. And at the same time, we can collect near-infrared spectra using a conventional near-infrared reflection probe, which is this long stick you can see here. Basically, it's light fibers that go down. Some of the fibers carry the light, another fiber brings the light back to the spectrometer, which is not visible in this image, but stands like a meter away, connected to a laptop, which collects the data. So what you can see here, when we humidify the air around the sample, we have a roughly linear weight decrease in the sample, which is seen in the graph, where the weight gain is on the y-axis and the time is on the x-axis. So basically, we have a sample that gets sucks up the moisture and gets more moist and more moist with time, and we measure near-infrared spectra at the same time. And these spectra look like this for the starch-derived products. Here's some example spectra. Again, from low moisture to high moisture is coded from red to blue. And again, we can see that the absorption band of the water, where the water region is, strictly goes up. So it gets stronger and stronger with time and with moisture. And what you can do now is use machine learning algorithms to calibrate a model with your reference data that we have from the moisture balance and our near-infrared spectra to calibrate the model that calculates moisture from the infrared spectra later, of course, without having to measure the weight of the sample. And this is what such a curve looks like in this case. So just for the people who haven't seen such a curve before, what we have here is the moisture calculated from the near-infrared measurement on the y-axis, given in percent of the total weight. And on the x-axis, we have the reference value, in this case, given from the moisture balance, also in percent. And the ideal case, of course, is if our near-infrared measurement gives exactly the same readings as the reference measurement, which is, of course, in real life never the case. But as we can see here, it is very close. The ideal curve is the black x equals y curve, and the measured values are given in blue. And we have a very nice R-squared value of very close to 1. And the root mean squared error, that's what the RMSE stands for, of under 0.1% moisture, which is a very nice result. So we see that the near-infrared based measurement for this kind of sample works very nicely. And so currently we are in the stage of the prototype development. We already have a prototype that is ready to go onto the spray dryer at Agrana. And hopefully very soon we will be able to test it inline and see how well it actually performs in the industrial environment. Now, the next application example is from the same project with the other company partner Fischerbrot. So basically what they need is an infrared based moisture sensor that measures contactlessly the moisture of dumpling bread. These are these bread cubes that you know from cooking maybe. And we also did some laboratory measurements for this case, but the problem is here, since in the future we will measure in a conveyor belt dryer, the sample will always be moving, also during the measurement. And so in order to simulate this in the laboratory, we had to also move the sample under our sensor. And that is why we used a rotation stage. And this you can see here in the image also, it's a home-built rotation stage, basically, where the sample is put in and it's rotating and moving under the sensor, which is collecting the spectra from the dumpling bread. And this gives the big problem that you cannot weigh and measure the near-infrared spectra at the same time because the samples are always moving. So what you have to do here is what is the standard case in the industry as well, is to take samples out of your process and actually then dry them and measure the weight difference to get the moisture reading. So the measurement was carried out like this. The measure bread, dumpling bread was moisturized in the beginning as homogeneously as possible. Then we used one 35-watt halogen lamp for drying. So this lamp is just firing onto the sample to dry it out. Sample is moving underneath it, and another lamps are on the measurement head that actually illuminate the sample for the near-infrared light that is later collected by the spectral sensor. And as I said, small samples were always taken and measured gravimetrically from time to time. And this gives us a roughly exponential drying curve, as we would expect when you dry a wet sample. So it roughly goes down from a rather high moisture of above 20% to a lower moisture of under 5%. So this is what it looks like. And the spectra, the near-infrared spectra that we measured at these points where we also measured the moisture using the offline measurement look like this. Again, coded from red to blue, from low moisture to high moisture. And again, as you would expect, the absorption around the water band goes up with moisture, but the spectra look a little bit different as for starch. Of course, it makes sense, it's a different product after all. But what they have in common is basically the water band is getting lower with increased, higher with increased moisture and lower with increased drying time. And again, a similar plot with the near-infrared measurement on the y-axis and reference measurement on the x-axis reveals that we again have a very nice correlation, which may be not as good as the one before, but still has a root mean squared error of under 1%, so 0.78%. But considering also the sampling error that we have in this case, because we're always taking samples out and we do not have a very representative sample, especially since we have to take small amounts, this is still a very nice result. And as you can see, we are rather close to the ideal curve still. So this results also led to the prototype environment development, which we are currently developing to have it installed in the conveyor belt dryer at Fischerbrot. And there's of course many precautions to take, since it's also a very hot environment, since it's inside of a dryer. Everything has to be taken care of, and also for it to be suitable for the food producing environment. Another application example out of the PSSP project, still in the food industry, but from a different project and with a different partner, namely Salinen Austria AG. We developed a near-infrared based, we are developing a near-infrared based moisture sensor for the inline measurement of salt. Here also, the laboratory measurements have already been conducted. Setup is rather similar. We have the scale and have the sample on top of it, but here we have a slightly different measurement head, again with halogen lamps shining on the sample and a collection optics to collect the light. And what they did, they sent us sealed bags with salt samples that have a defined moisture that they measured using two different gravimetric methods. So one is the rather quick way by just measuring using such a moisture balance that I talked about earlier. So basically you take the sample, put it in, dry it, and have a result. It's a rather quick measurement, but of course it's prone to errors as well. And you have the other, a little bit more precise, at least that's what is the common opinion. You take the sample, take it to a drying oven and dry it overnight and weigh it before and afterwards. So this basically takes all night. It takes longer, but you can be more certain that all of the moisture has left your sample. But of course, you also have a longer way from your production site where you take the sample to bring it to the oven, which introduces new errors. And in this graph, actually, I compared the values that were given using the moisture balance and using the overnight drying. So the moisture balance is on the y-axis, the overnight drying on the x-axis. And as you can see, the correlation is still okay, but it's not the best. you have an R squared of 0.82 and the root mean squared error of 0.17%. And I have to say that there's already an offset correction done in this case. So before the offset correction, the moisture balance always gave higher moisture readings than the overnight drying. So you can imagine all of these points just being shifted upwards, and the root mean squared error was actually 0.24%, if I remember correctly. So it was a little bit higher. This I already corrected for, because I think it's just the error that you get when you bring the sample from the production site to your overnight drying. And we also did near-infrared measurements of the same samples and compared it to the reference moisture. Again, such a graph with the near-infrared measurement on the y-axis and reference on the x-axis. And you can see there is a very nice correlation. It's basically very comparable to the one between the two reference methods. Actually, it's even a little bit better. We have a root mean squared error of 0.14%, and the two reference methods actually agree, not as good as we agree with either one of the two moisture reference methods actually. And so you can see that the main source of error is not really in the near-infrared measurement, but it's basically in the reference measurement. And it's always important to keep in mind that near-infrared measurements always rely on a reference method. So you always have to calibrate them before they work. And you always have the error of your reference method in your near-infrared method as well, because you train your near-infrared model with your reference measurements. So it's always good and important and necessary to have good reference measurements. But actually, what this should show you is that the main error is usually not in the near-infrared measurement. It's often in the reference method that is also prone to errors. But it has been used for many decades, and people usually forget that it's not the most precise thing in the world, but you also have some errors from there. Another example where we already have installed near-infrared based moisture sensors in the industry is from Lansing AG. It's also a result of the PSSP project. And there we developed 6 near-infrared based sensors and already successfully integrated them into the production process for contact moisture measurement of these cellulose fibers that they produce. And since then, they already are using this real-time moisture data to optimize the process conditions in terms of energy efficiency and also product quality. And I have here some data that were measured with their samples. You can see on the left side again, near-infrared spectra. This time you can clearly see a difference, but what again is there that with increased moisture, the signal at 19-20 nanometers around significantly changes, so we can exploit this to measure the moisture of the sample. And in the second graph, you can again see the reference moisture against the near-infrared moisture. In this case, the axes are switched, since this is out of a software that we use to calibrate the sensor, and there the axes are changed because it was easier to program, to be honest. And the reference moisture is here on the y-axis and the near-infrared moisture on the x-axis, and you can see again the red line is the ideal line, and our values spread around this with a root mean squared error of about 0.6 to 7% moisture in the whole range from about 4% to 18% moisture of the samples. And on the right side, you see a schematic drawing of roughly how the sensor looks, but you've seen this image already a couple of slides earlier. Okay, with this, I'm already at the end of my talk, and I want to give you a short summary. I hope I was able to show you or remind you, if you already knew, that near-infrared spectroscopy is a very powerful measurement technique, especially also for moisture measurement. It is inline capable. It is automatic and real-time with short measurement times and automatic data evaluation. You have very flexible optical interfaces, so basically a lot of different samples can be measured, and it can be integrated in a lot of different production processes. And of course, it is non-destructive and is also not requiring any laser or special safety precautions, which is also nice. The spectral measurements allow for higher precision and reliability compared to also often used 2-point measurements. So there's a lot of instruments around that use basically 2 wavelengths and not really measure a whole spectrum. So basically they measure at 1 wavelength where water does absorb and 1 wavelength where water doesn't absorb or doesn't absorb as much, and use these 2 points to give you a moisture reading. But when you do a full spectral measurement, you can have higher precision, and also you can get simultaneous information about additional parameters of your sample. Some examples that I talked about is the protein content, fat content, ash content, but there's many others that are possible to be measured with near-infrared spectroscopy. And of course, one of the main novelties in this sector is a MEMS-based near-infrared spectrometer technology that now allows the realization of much more cost-efficient and compact moisture sensors that actually don't just measure 2 points, but measure continuous spectra, giving you all the benefits of having a spectral measurement, but for a much lower price. With this, I want to thank all of the company partners and all of our funding agencies, and of course also all of my colleagues at the Infrared and Raman Group at the RECENDT GmbH. And of course, I want to thank you for your attention. And just in case you want to get in contact, the contact data is in the presentation as well. So thank you very much.
Thank you.